And before you are going to start, you can see in the people that want to hear to the translation, you can see in the bottom, I will explain in Spanish, okay? Aquellos que quieren escuchar la traducción al español, y después les aviso que la conferencia grabada va a estar únicamente en el idioma original en inglés. Tienen abajo el icono Interpretation, tienen que presionarlo y cuando lo presionan van a ver que dice Original Audio English y Spanish. Entonces lo que ustedes hacen es presionar Spanish. En el momento que presionan Spanish van a escuchar no a Allan lo van a escuchar de lejos, van a escuchar la traducción de nuestra intérprete. ¿Ok? So, we will start. Okay. Ariel, you can help me with the admission of the participant. Okay. Okay. And welcome. Welcome to Auditorium, our series of online conference on Jewish education today. And we welcome Dr. Allan Hofman. And this conference, the name is Changing Paradigms up to November 2023 for Israel Diaspora Relations and Implications for Jewish Education. Allan Hofman is the executive chair of the management committee of Hamakom, a major new youth center to be built in Tel Aviv. Original from South Africa, he most recently served as CEO of the Jewish Agency for Israel for a decade, and the Director General of the agency's Education Department for a decade before that. From 1981, he worked at University where he directed the Melton Center for Jewish Education and worked with Morton Mandel to create the CIGE in New York. Allan Hofman is lecturer now in our EVU program in the EVU University. And now I want to welcome to Allan. Allan, you can start.
So Erev Tov, good evening to everybody here. These are obviously very troubling times for Israel. Many of us, I think, who live here and have lived here for a long time, have still not gotten over the shock of October the 7th. So many of the kind of core assumptions about Israel's security and preparedness collapsed on that Shabbat and Chag. And it's not our topic tonight, but I don't think that we can begin this session without mentioning the fact that some of our children and our grandchildren are currently serving in Miluim, serving in the Israeli army, and I think our prayers of all the people on this in this class, I'm sure, go to Tzal and also to the Chatufim, to the hostages who were 240 hostages who were taken on that horrible day. I should say that I'm not sure, I asked Marcelo, this may be one of the only Hebrew University academic programs that actually is currently taking place, this online Masters in Jewish Education. The university postponed its classes immediately after October the 7th, and then postponed again. And currently we have a date for the first semester to begin around the first week of January. But as long as we have 350,000 miluim recruited and not discharged, I'm very doubtful whether any of the universities will, in fact, begin their semester. And it looks as though we will be having 2 shortened semesters that will probably go late into the summer months. I'm assuming that everybody who's in this call who is a Jewish educator, just by virtue of the fact that you are connected to this program as a former student, as a current student, or whatever your connection is, there are people here who I remember as participants in the senior educators program at the Milton Center, that you're engaged either practically or certainly conceptually in Israel education, and that is the topic of our meeting tonight. I came to Israel a very long time ago. I came to Israel as a volunteer in the Six-Day War from South Africa, where I'd been very active in the Zionist youth movement. I would love to say that I was the only 3-year-old volunteer, but that would not be true. And I came to Israel in 1967 as a volunteer and have lived in this country with a few breaks for graduate study in the United States ever since. And I think that over the more than 50 years that I've lived in Israel and been involved in this field of Jewish education and Israel education, there have been a series of different paradigms, and that's the topic of our meeting tonight. Different paradigms that have kind of dominated the way we think about Israel diaspora relations and their implications for Jewish education. We should remember that it was world Jewry with a very tiny minority living in Palestine that over 120 years ago gave birth to the state of Israel. And this tiny fledgling has today, demographically, has more than a majority of all the Jews living in the world today. So that clearly the relations between Israel and the Jewish diaspora around the world have undergone a series of different changes. I want to remind us, and I'm asking Marcelo, I'm not a big expert on this new technology. I'm asking Marcelo to put up a PowerPoint. And in the PowerPoint, you'll see that already in Israel's Declaration of Independence, there is a tiny paragraph, comes almost right at the end, that is not too often spoke about. But it says there, Anu korim el ha'am ha'yehudi b'chol ha'tfutzot. I'll translate, don't worry, Daniela. אנחנו קוראים אל העם היהודי בכל התפוצות להתלכד סביב היישוב בעלייה ובבניין ולעמוד לימינו במערכה גדולה על הגשמת שאיפת הדורות לגאולת ישראל. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of 1, immigration and upbuilding, and 2, to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. And I think it's very interesting, clearly, that in the compromises that Ben-Gurion hammered out in creation, the Declaration of Independence, that already there is a theological imperative. There is an imperative in terms of world Jews being involved in this new fledgling newborn state, and it's a theological imperative, the redemption of Israel. And I think that that in itself is a little unusual, that a state got created in its founding charter. It already talks about its relationship with the rest of the Jewish people. Remember, only 600,000 Jews living in Israel, in the Yishuv, on the day the state came into being, and 15 million Jews pre-Holocaust, post-Holocaust, I'm sorry, living outside of Israel. Shekef Marcelo. So I'd like to go quickly through a sketch of the different Israel diaspora paradigms from that time, from the time of the creation of the state, and also talk about some of the examples of educational translations of those paradigms. So I want to argue that when the state came into being, there were two major parallel trajectories, two major paradigms in terms of the relationship between the Jews of the world and the Jews of Israel. There was a paradigm of classical Zionism, very strongly resting on Klatskin, negation of the diaspora. The role, the view of the diaspora was it was a reservoir for Aliyah. Remember, Aliyah is mentioned in that Declaration of Independence that I spoke about. But already from the very beginning, there was a different paradigm, which is the paradigm of the state of Israel and world Jewry, state of Israel, both as crisis and as miracle, both of which kind of pointed to the precariousness of Israel's survival. Remember, we're talking about a generation who had known the Holocaust, many of whom were survivors, many of whom could still remember Jewish life that had been totally destroyed in Eastern Europe. That was still a majority of world Jewry. And this sees a period in which, once the state is created, that the institutions for the strengthening of the state of Israel from a distance, by Magbiot, by the campaigns, the UJA had already come into being in the 20s and 30s. But once the state is created, even in America, and in America, the UJA is created late. The Keren HaYesod is actually created before, and in countries like Latin America, in which the classical Zionist paradigm is the dominant paradigm in terms of Israel diaspora relations, or even countries like Britain, Australia, in South Africa, in terms of English speaking. It was only late that Brandeis and Zionism, Brandeis managed to help construct a form of American Zionism, and its main translation took the form not so much of classical Zionism, but rather in terms of the support of Israel through the Maccabeot, through the campaigns, through financial support. That gave the Jews of the world the ability to participate vicariously in this great new task of the Jewish people in the state building, creation of a state. In education, I personally remember that in the Zionist youth movement in South Africa, in those years, we were arguing about galut, about centrality of Israel. We were arguing about what does it mean for Israel to become a central component of Jewish life. As I said at the very beginning of this meeting, demography has changed that completely. All this, the aliyah of the last 75 years has created a situation where the issue of centrality of Israel is not just a conceptual question, it's a demographic question, and it's been completely resolved. Classical Zionism found its translation through the Zionist youth movements. They were branches of the Israeli political parties and of the chalutzim and the non-chalutzim, the religious Zionists. Israel, already from this period, was helping to provide teachers to Jewish schools in the diaspora. And this is the period that the institutions that some of you know about and maybe have heard about, talked about, the Machon LaMadrichei Chutz Laaretz was created long before the State of Israel. Machon Greenberg was created in order to train teachers. And Daniel Hartman, not David Hartman, but his son David Hartman, talks about this being a period in which there's a strong emphasis in Jewish education between Galut, that's the negation of the diaspora, and Geulah, which is the miracle and the redemption, actually, that is spoken about in the Declaration of Israel. עוד שקף, בבקשה, another slide. Fast forward to 1967. We don't have much time, and I'd like to leave some time for questions and discussion. 1967, I came to Israel, just tell you personally, the head of the Jewish agency at that time, Louis Pincus, after the Chayalim, the Israeli soldiers had been recruited, called up, very much like we had now, a waiting period before the actual entry into Gaza, where there was a 6-week waiting period after Yom Ha'atzmaut and before the Six-Day War, June of 1967. And during that period, as the kibbutzim on Israel's borders, once again, it was an issue, like now, of the settlements that actually marked the green line of the border. There was a call for volunteers, and groups of volunteers actually got up and came. And I came to Kibbutz Mayam Baruch, all the way in the finger of the Galilee, past Kiryat Shmone, past Kibbutz Dan, right on what was then the Syrian border. And we worked in the fields for 6 months, and I remained in Israel. And on the 3rd day of that war, a war that the fear was Israel could possibly never, this was a real existential danger, different, I think, from the situation today. In the middle of that, I think on the Wednesday of that 6-day war, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem was conquered, the Kotel was conquered, and on the Friday, we saw from Kibbutz the trenches, Kibbutz Mayan Baruch, the Israeli jets, and then the Israeli armor conquering Ramat Golan. The Sinai was conquered in the same war, and Israel moved overnight from the 1948 paradigm of classical Zionism, all crisis and miracle, to triumphalism. This was an incredible victory. And what I think you see after 1967 is huge parts of world Jewry in North America, in Europe, in Latin America. Latin America that really happened already before this. And in the rest of the Jewish world, the Jewish people en bloc buying into the relationship with Israel as a core part of their Jewish identity. And in the United States, the federations that had been created for social needs, Jewish social needs, suddenly became the arm for fundraising. AIPAC was created, and the American Jewish, what was before that a non-Zionist community, became all part of this, I think, brand new paradigm of the centrality of Israel to Jewish life. Many, many things happened in education, but the two things I want to point out very strongly in the period after 1967 are the birth of the Israel experience, the fact of there was a lot of tourism. Jews started pouring into Israel. People began to see the effect of coming to Israel. In those days, not for 10 days, but for 6 weeks. Latin Americans were way ahead of the game with the creation of taboos in the next decade and the following decade. South Africa created programs like an Ulpan for the students of the Jewish day schools. And the whole notion of the Israel experience as an educational response post-1967 was put on the map. Also, the Orthodox gap year in Israel that had been something only for the few slowly became a rite de passage, so that there is virtually by now not a single Orthodox Jewish day school in the world, yeshiva and modern Orthodox, where after the end of high school, young people don't come to Israel. I think I have to go a bit faster. Marcelo Shekev. So I want to move to the 1970s. In the 1970s, you already have this new role of Israel in strengthening the diaspora. And an interesting thing that you probably don't know, you've all heard of this Sochnut, but I don't know if you know that in the 1972, the Jewish Agency was reconstituted. The Jewish Agency was founded by the League, after the League of Nations, as part of the Balfour Declaration in the 1920s, was founded by the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was the Baal Habayit of Keren Hayesod, the JNF, the Jewish Agency, and those were the national institutions. Jewish Agency had given birth to the State of Israel. In the 1970s, the fundraisers came and said, no taxation without representation. We want to be a partnership in this enterprise. And so in 1971, 72, finalized in 73, the Jewish Agency is totally reconstituted so that world Jewry is actually a 50-50 partner. It's a hugely important symbolic statement. And this is the period that Morala Baron, who had been Chief Education Officer of the Army and the head of Dayan's Bureau in the Six-Day War, becomes a very important person in the Jewish Agency. And you have new things beginning, like community shlichim. Shlichim don't just go to be ideological spokesmen of Zionism. They come to communities all over the world to actually work with the community in engaging them in Israel, not necessarily for the purpose of Aliyah. Hebrew language becomes a much more important factor. And in Latin America, this is the generation in the 70s and 80s of Tapuz, wholesale cohorts of people in their high school years come to Israel for a 6-week intensive Israel experience, which takes us into the 1980s and 1990s, Marcelo, in which the local communities come to realize that world Jewry has a role in strengthening Israel, either through Aliyah, even though Aliyah never becomes a mass movement until the end of this decade, with Russian Aliyah at the very end of the 1980s. I'll say something about that in a moment. But there is a realization that Israel, the connection to Israel, can be a key factor in strengthening the local identity of young people, young students. And so this term gets created, Israel engagement. We want to engage our young people with Israel as a way of making them better Jews in Buenos Aires or Mexico or Sao Paulo or Chicago or New York or wherever, Melbourne and Johannesburg, of course. This is very, very important. This is a brand new realization that the more we can get our young people to engage with Israel, the more we can make them better Jews in the places in which they live. And so this is the place, this is the time when the Hebrew University creates the Senior Educators Program that existed for 20 years. Some of you may even know people or may have come. I see a couple here have come on the Senior Educators Program. The Senior Educators Program had a requirement. You could not make Aliyah. You had to go back to your community and work in your community and use what you learned in Israel to strengthen your local community. And then later, the Jerusalem Fellows, which was a 3-year program, they took some Israelis, they played with putting together Israelis together with diaspora educators. All of the rabbinical training programs slowly began to create mandatory years in Israel, whether it was the Orthodox program or the conservative program in America or the Reform program or the Seminario Rabbinico in Latin America. Many of you, I'm sure, on this call know rabbis who themselves came to Israel and were both on the Senior Educators and the Seminario Rabbinico as part of their training to become pulpit leaders in their local communities. And this is the period in which Birthright, right at the end of this period. I should mention, just before this, that late in this couple of decades, towards the end of the 1980s and into the 90s, we have really the only major wave of Aliyah to Israel that took place after the first decade of the State of Israel. Israel grew from 600,000 Jews to doubled its Jewish population within its first 5 years, and then redoubled its population within another 10 years. And then between 1989, 1990 was really the largest year of Soviet Aliyah, about 150,000 Olim. But all in all, from the time of Let My People Go and the gates being opened, close to 1.2 million Jews, some would say 200,000 of them are not Jews. One of the big debates still in Israel's society, and in my opinion, one of the great missed opportunities of the Jewish people in our era, have come have made Aliyah. And this is the period in which, in education, birthright taglit begins to be conceived of. Philanthropists come to understand that Israel has such an incredible potential, and there seems to be such magic, not fully understood, in this experience that young people have in Israel. Why don't we try to get every young Jew to come to Israel? And we'll water it down to 8 days. And so Taglit begins early in this and into the 1990s. It continues today. And at the Jewish Agency, at the very end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000, Masa is created with a goal to bring 1 out of every 5 young Jews to Israel for a year, either after high school or during their college years or immediately after college. And this takes us all the way to 2000, where we begin to see the emergence of a new paradigm. It's not the paradigm of engagement. It's a paradigm of Jewish peoplehood. And Jewish peoplehood is used, Amiyut Yehudit, Jewish peoplehood. Jewish people is used as a tent. In many ways, I would argue, I think I once wrote an article about this. There's a term in arithmetic. There's a highest common multiple, and there's lowest common denominator. And in many ways, I think Jewish peoplehood becomes the kind of biggest tent, the lowest common denominator, in order to talk about what is the devik, what is the glue that keeps Jews together. And the idea behind this is probably familiar to all of you. The idea behind this is that wanting to be part of one Jewish people is actually what connects the Jews of Israel and world Jewry. And in education, you begin to see a whole lot of new kinds of models. One of the models Jewish Agency developed, Partnership 2000. Local communities partner with Israeli communities so that the children of one community will have children of Beit Shan, and the children of Cleveland will have a common experience, both in Beit Shan and in. This is a much more mutual, much more equivalent kind of paradigm of Israel diaspora relations. And there are many of these things: school twinning, different kinds of connection. The Jewish Agency today has an entire division that's called Connect. And during the period that I was CEO, one of the things that I helped to invent was this notion of shinshinim. Some of you are probably familiar with Shinshin Israelis who do a year of service before they go into the army. Shinshin stands for Shnat Sherut. The Shinshinim do a year of service. It was usually with deprived communities in Israel. And we invented a model. Excuse me. We invented a model where young Israelis could do their Shnat Sherut in a diaspora community, living in London in a comuna with a Tzofim, 25 Shinshinim in Toronto. They're now Shinshinim all over the world. And the model of Shinshinim talks about this new kind of mutuality. It's not only about what this young Israeli will give to the family he lives or she lives with, to the school in which he works, to the community, or to the early childhood program, or to the JCC. But what that young Israeli learns about world Jewry and is able to come back and bring to Israeli society. And so you have more and more models in the last couple of decades that are models of a paradigm of mutuality. Not clear how much Israelis have fully bought into that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And in the decade from about 2010, we move into a decade, Marcelo, we move into a decade of complexity. This is a decade where the big issue is distancing. Everybody is talking about distancing of world Jewry from Israel and the problems of this, all the models that I've been talking about. In America, for 10 years, they used to count the number of Jews. After 2000, they stopped counting the number of Jews because the number seems to be going down. And there's a huge argument about who is a Jew in America. And during this period now, recently, the Pew Report comes out. And one of its most important categories, if we had time, we'd spend time here analyzing the Pew Report, is what do young Jews of different ages feel? And there seems to be an inverse correlation. More and more young Jews are coming to Israel on programs like Taglit and Masa, and maybe during high school and with their families. And yet those same kids, when they're young, are less committed to Israel. You have the issue of intermarriage. There's a program in his famous program in America called the Wexner program. People get funded to become rabbis and cantors and Jewish educators. It also has a part of a program at Harvard. Some of you may have heard that the Wexner program just announced that it's breaking its connections with Harvard because of what happened in Harvard in the last 2 or 3 years. And the Wexner program has an annual seminar for its people who are in the program. And they asked me many years ago, it was probably during this period, sometime between 2010 2020, to actually be a scholar in residence at a seminar that was run for people who were going to be funded by the Wexner program to be rabbis. And one of the people said to me, you know, I'm in a rabbinical program, I think Reform movement, a conservative movement. My parents are converts. And everybody talks about the 3 pillars of Elohei Israel, the God of Israel, Torah Israel, the religion of Israel, and the land of Israel. But my parents, who were converts and came to Judaism as Protestants. Land is not a category. I don't understand why land has to be a category. Why can't we have a Jewish people with Torah Israel and Elohei Israel? Why do we need Eretz Israel? So whether you believe that intermarriage is diluting the Jewish people, or whether you believe, like some sociologists, that it's strengthening Jewish people, and this has created 8 million Jews in America rather than 5 million Jews in America. That's the big debate. There's no doubt that the kind of instinctive connection to Israel has been under siege and has created distance. Israeli politics, particularly for Jews who've grown up in societies where Jews are associated with liberalism. In some ways, it's been quite difficult in the last decade to be a liberal and a supporter of Israel. And then in Israel itself, there is a debate on the future of diaspora Jewry. Is this what you would say in Hebrew, Mishenet Kaneh Ratzutz? Is this a reed that you cannot actually hold on to and rely on? So on the one hand, the government of Israel has created a ministry of diaspora affairs. It's been given a lot of money. But not only has there, over this whole period, I think, not been a change in the Israeli public discourse in terms of strengthening the relationship to Israel, but somehow, in some ways, there have been voices, including, by the way, our Prime Minister, who have said on several occasions, diaspora Jewry is shriveling on the vine. It's getting weaker. Some people would say, aside from the Orthodox. And even in a book that I'm holding here, that I don't think you can see because it's blurred, but edited by Johnny Ariel, some of you may know, a book that's worth looking at called Israel Education, The Next Edge, that was published in 2020. And I'm looking at the table of contents, and you see an article, these are by very serious people. John Levison, a professor at Brandeis. His article is called Mature Love, Nuanced Loyalty, and Redemptive Vision. And his whole article is about, in Jewish education and Israel education, what is mature love of Israel? What is nuanced loyalty? And what is redemptive vision? Rachel Fish, Dr. Rachel Fish, another scholar of Israel, her article she called the intersection of content, context, and complexity. And Alex Thompson, a British Jew, Dr. Alex Thompson, who lives in Israel and worked at the Melton Center, calls his article Devoted, Disengaged, Disillusioned. So I urge you to have a look at this, and it may actually be online, and I'm sure Marcelo will know where to find it. But it's an interesting, I'm going to come to this in a minute, Marcelo, but it's interesting that this is a period of complexity in the face of distancing from Israel. It's also a time in which the campus becomes a very complicated new arena. And at the Jewish Agency, there's something called Israel Fellows on campuses, whose job is to work with young students about how to deal with this complexity. I have a long quote here, but I'm not sure I'm going to read it, which comes from another article in that book called Israel World Jewry Relations, the Third Era, by Zohar Aviv, who's the educational director of Birthright. It's from that same book. And he basically talks about three stages for Israeli Jewry, not only for world Jewry, in terms of the need of a new paradigm for Israelis. First, he says we need a genuine recognition of the state of Israel as the national homeland of the entire Jewish people, not only of the Jewish people of Israel. This is for Israelis, remember. Second, he says we need a transition from a unilateral to a bilateral perception. There has to be respect and a deep knowledge, which precedes respect, of the assets, powers, and challenges, not only for financial and political support, but for the discourse that defines Jewish life. And the third stage that the Zohar Aviv talks about is that we have to create communities that learn and nurture one another in a consistent, not in crisis only, and reciprocal manner by acknowledging each community's essential role in deepening the other communities' intracommunal discourse and reinforcing its aspects of Jewish existence. And so, Marcelo, this brings us to October the 7th. And October the 7th catches us, in my opinion, it catches us in this period of hitlaptut, of distancing, of dilemma, of complexity, of mature love, nuanced loyalty. And how does it connect with redemptive vision? And so I actually believe that Israel will be a very different Israel after this war. I think that this country, I hope and pray, I have no doubt that we will win this war. And I hope that the cost will not be greater than the terrible cost we have already paid, particularly the civilian cost. But I think that this war will bring Israel to a reflection on some of the very core questions of what the society is about. The protest movement from January of 2023 until October 23 had already begun. Those protests in the streets of Tel Aviv every Saturday night, 60-something weeks, couldn't have been 60. It must have been 40-something, however many weeks it was, of demonstrations and articles in the newspaper had already, I think, begun to push Israelis, both from the right and the left, to ask some very profound questions about what does it mean to be a Jewish and democratic society, and what I would add and hope that this becomes a critical ingredient of the self-searching and the discussion that is inevitably going to take place after this. What does it mean to be a Jewish society in terms of our engagement with the rest of the Jewish people? And I could say a lot about this, and it's another long conversation. And I see that there are 13 different comments in the chat, and I'm going to stop here. Questions and comments. They all seem to be in Spanish.
Okay, we are about 30 people. You can raise the hand and talk as maybe in Spanish, puede ser en español, and the interpreter will translate, or maybe in English direct. Okay. Who want to start? Want to be the second?
אפשר שאלה?
Felix? Yes.
Javier Herrera desde Miami.
Ah, Cynthia,
Oh, ok.
please.
Espero.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hofman. I actually don't have any more to add.
It would be
to-
great if you said where you live and what you
I
do.
live in Mexico, in
Hi.
Mexico City. I'm about to graduate from the MA, and I work at the Hebraica University as an academic director.
Regards
And
to Danny Feinstein.
okay, I will do so tomorrow. And I only have to say thank you. Thank you very much for this extraordinary setting of the status in which we are in this paradigm as Jewish educators. And first of all, I think we have to rethink which is our status as Jews. Either we are in Israel or in the diaspora, because I think we are in a very important turning point in these relations and in our identification with our Judaism and the land of Israel. So thank you so much. It brought a lot of light. Thank you.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
Don't hesitate to talk in Spanish. I understand that your questions or your comments get automatically translated. It's amazing. And
איך אתם מרימים את הידיים
that
האלה?
amazing is called Daniela.
Okay, Felix, okay. And next we have Michelle and Craig.
Okay. So it's my turn? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. I didn't find the hand to raise. אז ככה, שתי שאלות, קודם כל תודה לך על ההרצאה. השאלה הראשונה...
No, Felix, or Spanish or English.
Okay, so in English,
Okay.
have you seen, first of all, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. My first question is, have you seen a documentary called Israelism? And what's your opinion about it? And second, if this problem we have in campuses, and I'm talking about the Jewish students that are becoming fervently anti-Zionists, if it's a result of an uncritical education on Israel for the last generation, if we had hypothetically given more room to criticism, maybe we could avoid these painful crossroads. Thank you very much.
Felix, you know, it's a very strong question. And, you know, we have seen the distancing from Israel already over a long period before this current wave that is sweeping the world. And I think that in the years that decade I worked as CEO of the Jewish Agency with Natan Sharansky, who was extremely concerned about the campuses. And we began to put Israel fellows on campuses, first in America and then in other places around the world. One of the things that I think changed, I was a graduate student in I'm a South African, as you know, but I was a graduate student for 3 years at an American university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the ones that everybody's talking about now. And when I went to college, this was what I called the period of Israeli triumphalism. Israel could do no wrong. The faculty of the university were both intellectually interested, deeply committed, they themselves came out of a different liberalism of a different period. I think one of the things that's happened in the world, it started in Europe. And remember that we have seen Islamic, the influence of Islamicism. France is a great example, but Britain is another example. Countries that have many millions of Islamic immigrants who have come to these institutions. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that the faculty of universities have themselves, it's a new generation of faculty. And that's very, very difficult for Jewish students to deal with. I do think that in Jewish education, I'm not sure whether it's about critical. I'm not sure that our approach to Israel has been thoughtful enough, and nor do I think it's been strong enough. That means I actually believe that in education in general and in Jewish education, one has to have a threshold of intensity in the same way as you have to turn up the heat in your stove to get the gas to a certain heat before a pot boils. You have to have a certain threshold of intensity of content before you're actually able to make a difference in the way young people actually understand and interpret a given phenomenon. And I'm not sure that all of Jewish agency passes the threshold of intensity test. And within that, for a long time, we took the connection to Israel for granted, so that Zionist history, the knowledge of facts, the issue of nuanced loyalty. You know, what does mature love, nuanced loyalty, and redemptive vision actually mean? Those are very complicated concepts. First, let's make sure that we have teachers who understand those concepts. Not easy. Devoted, disengaged, and disillusioned. I think we have a very big job in terms of the young people, in terms of the people who come into contact with young people. And remember that in the biggest diaspora of the world, only a tiny, tiny fraction of non-Orthodox young Jews get any Jewish education. And to think that an 8-day trip to Israel can magically do this because the drinking age is 18 and one can have an incredible social experience. It's just unrealistic. And I think that I'll tell you something interesting. Even in the Orthodox community, and I'll keep quiet so you can answer some more questions. Yeshiva University this year in New York has its biggest registration ever. And they have the biggest registration of young Jews who are accepted to Ivy League institutions and chose to come to YU because they thought they would not be comfortable. And what it's going to mean for young Jews to be comfortable in this rite de passage of going to college is one of the big issues that Jewish educators and Jewish leaders and Jewish philanthropists are going to have to deal with in the decade to come.
Okay. Just a word about the context now where you are were talking, Alan. Here we heard the bombs attack now not in Renana, but in Gibraltar, Marzlia, near from here. This is the context of this conference. Michelle, your question.
Michelle, we can't hear you.
Michelle, we
Still can't hear you. Now you're on mute.
No, Michelle, if you want, write the question, okay, and I will read because we can hear. In the meantime, Marisa. No, we can't hear, Michelle. Marisa,
you're on mute.
Sí, no, antes que nada saludarte, Alan, decirte la alegría enorme que me da volver a encontrarte y como mencionabas antes, en uno de los paradigmas educativos para mí el programa de Bejirín fue una experiencia hermosa que me formó, lo mismo que ahora el máster que estamos haciendo dentro del Melton. Y dentro del máster estuvimos trabajando en un seminario con Yossi Goldstein, el texto que mencionabas de voto, desilusionados y distanciados. Justamente mi inquietud es un poco lo que preguntaba Félix y lo que respondías vos, ¿no? Siento que hay una inquietud muy importante con respecto a lo que está sucediendo en los campus de las universidades, no solamente en Estados Unidos, sino en diferentes lugares, donde se ve como la identidad de los jóvenes judíos, pero sorprende que a veces les falta argumentación, es decir, cómo defender y cómo argumentar su defensa y su lealtad. Vos mencionabas el concepto de lealtad, que es un concepto importante también. Quizá toda la cuestión de la educación judía dentro de la diáspora con respecto a la centralidad de Israel, si faltara pensar en justamente lo que viene en el eje de la desilusión, ¿no? Es decir, cómo transmitir una educación donde se incluya la historia política de Israel, porque después los jóvenes en los campus quedan con poco argumento para poder argumentar, ¿no? Para poder defenderse. Y como mencionabas antes, hay un antisemitismo que tiene que ver con el antisionismo, frente al cual por ahí no los preparamos para un antisemitismo, digamos, que tiene que ver con otra época, y con una empatía a nivel mundial con respecto al Islam o a lo que implica la pancarta de Free Palestine. Es decir, como toda una cuestión que parece difícil de poder desarmarlo desde dentro del campo de la educación, ¿no? Es decir, cómo repensar la educación, con qué herramientas, cómo sería el diseño curricular para incluir estas cuestiones.
So, you know, I think, Marisa, that this is part of my concern that we have not invented, at least in non-Orthodox Jewish life, and I'll say something about Orthodox, we have not invented a form of Jewish life and Jewish identity, and therefore Jewish education, that actually passes what I call the threshold of intensity test. So that the answer to the question of why be Jewish is that's the first question, which is, I need to be able to answer why be Jewish, both at the conceptual and intellectual level, but also at the affective level. One of the amazing things that the halakha gives to Orthodox Jews is a 365-day, 24-hour set of rules by which, even if you don't have fully worked out the answer to the question of why be Jewish, you have what Peter Berger called, the sociologist of religion, plausibility structure that is built into your life. And that faces crisis. And there's a problem with modernity, as Peter Berger, the sociologist, said. And Michael Rosenak at the Melton Center for years worked on this and wrote about this. But I think that in the Jewish communities in which Jews live, and by the way, Israel is not patur. Israel is not I've forgotten the word. It has not been exhausted, or whatever the word is. Accepted from this as well. I think that in Israel, there are big tracts of Israeli society who also, we talk about a state that is a Jewish and democratic state, but what do we mean by Jewish? And what do we mean by, and how do we build a version of Jewish life and Jewish culture that is not necessarily based on halakha and mitzvot, that is rich enough and meaningful enough that a young person who comes to university says to himself, I'm not just going to duck and lie low for the next 4 years or 3 years, but I have something that's important enough for me to pursue and to defend. And in that sense, I don't know what anti-Semitism, the new anti-Semitism, is actually going to do to the Jewish world. Is the new anti-Semitism going to push people away? Or is it going to be a wake-up call? Or is it going to be both this and that? And how are the leaders of world Jewry can actually deal with this?
Okay.
And Marisa, dash la'achich.
Okay. If you have other one question, because we are in the final of this activity. One question.
Yo quiero hacer una pregunta, por favor.
Sí.
Javier.
Gracias. Soy Javier Herrera, estudiante de doctorado en Filosofía de Liderazgo en Educación en Kaiser University en Estados Unidos. Soy cristiano llamado a honrar y respetar al pueblo de Israel. Mi tesis doctoral la quiero hacer precisamente sobre la educación judía, particularmente en el periodo de 1980 a 2013, y el doctor mencionó buena parte de ese periodo. Y mi pregunta es, entiendo que el conflicto afecta la educación en Israel, pero ¿cómo lo ha afectado en la diáspora o en Estados Unidos? Si es distante, parece que son indiferentes o no, independiente de la lealtad de cada persona al pueblo de Israel. ¿Qué podría decirme sobre lo que está sucediendo con la educación, especialmente, pues, educación judía, especialmente acá en Estados Unidos, por causa del conflicto? Y ya después me gustaría poderme comunicar con el doctor Dorfman acerca de mi tesis doctoral y pedir su colaboración con material documental. Muchas gracias.
Look, you know, we're coming to the end of our time, and I could talk about this for a very long time, and there are people here on this call who probably know more about this from their daily experience than me, than I do. But Javier, you know, the Jewish community in the United States and the Jewish community all over the world is in a huge crisis, and it ranges from armed guards at every Jewish educational institution in the last month in the United States. Some of the people on this call work and live in countries where there have been armed guards at Jewish institutions for 30 or 40 years already. It ranges from the fact that Jews who have been instructed by their rabbis to take their kippot off so as not to be identified in public transport. It ranges to the fact that, particularly in the non-Orthodox world, there is a great fear amongst principals of schools that parents may be scared to register their children. It ranges to the fact that educators don't know how to explain to the kids in their classrooms either what's happening in Israel and why it's happening in Israel. The fact that by and large, the West, liberal West, believed that after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism of the kind that was exhibited on the October the 7th had come to an end. This is on the one hand, a wake-up call and a period of great confusion. And I'm happy to be retired. That means not only in the institution that I ran, the Jewish Agency for Israel, with 2,000 shlichim, it sends every year, including Israeli soldiers who this past summer were in American Jewish summer camps and Jewish summer camps all over the world, some of whom have been killed over this last month. So we're people who are shlichim, working with young Jews at Jewish summer camps with 15-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and slept with them in their bunks, were killed on the 7th of October on that in that massacre. So I don't know where this is going to take us, but I believe that there is going to be a huge re-examination, and I think we have to look a bit backwards at these different paradigms and think about, you know, if each one of us, if we were able to reconstruct a new paradigm for what Israel and the diaspora world Jewry should look like, what would it look like and what would education look like? Those are two different topics, but they're totally connected.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Allan, for this huge conference. And thank you very much to all the survivors of this hour, but maybe survivor is not the best
Not a good term.
question. But seriously, thank you for your participation. We are going to, we recorded the conference. We're going to send you the link, and I hope to see you in our next activities in Sunday, 19 in November. We are going to organize the panel with Spanish directors, and Sunday 26th, we are going to organize the same panel with English director to talk about the scope or the how to confront this situation in the Jewish school in the diaspora. The first with Ethel Barilka, the second with Dr. Alex Thompson, and we hope to see you in one of the panel or the two.
So
Allan,
before we leave, I just want to say that these days in Israel, when you meet somebody or talk to them on the phone, it's quite difficult to actually
how
say
are you?
hello, to say hello, to say, how are you, or manishma. And it's a little awkward every time you meet somebody. But today, Israelis finish their meetings one with each other with saying to each other, Besorot tovot. I wish you that we will hear good news in the future. And so thank you to everybody, and I wish us all Besorot tovot.
Thank you all, and